Hello. Today we're going to be analyzing and interpreting Peter Bruegel the Elder's The Peasant Wedding to answer the question, how does art interact with the values of society that created it? Before we dive into this Renaissance masterpiece, we need some background information. As society tried to rebuild from the disastrous Middle Ages, Greek and Roman texts were revisited, and the idea of humanism, that life should be celebrated, and that individual potential, achievement, and life itself should just be cherished and appreciated as opposed to living solely to serve the church. Now, most early Renaissance art was patroned, so the artists focused on highlighting the requested subject's individual beauty since they were getting paid. Examples include the Mona Lisa, where a wealthy merchant paid to have his wife painted. A wife of a wealthy merchant is obviously a high-class citizen herself, and Da Vinci painted her individually so all of the focus was on her, and did so in a way that was certainly realistic, but focused on accentuating her beauty more than realism. Similarly, the church patroned Michelangelo's David sculpture, so he made David in a way that would be pleasing to the church. Once again, David is a biblical hero, so he is another high-class individual, and Michelangelo sculpted him in a powerful yet graceful pose. The fact that he is sculpted individually causes viewers to focus on his beauty alone, just like the Mona Lisa, and the fact that he is 18 feet tall means that he towers over viewers, giving David a feeling of even more power. Here, we see humanism being celebrated in art by focusing on the beauty of high-class individuals, not really by the idea of life itself. Artists did not really have much of a choice, as they had to do what they were paid to do, and powerful people in the church were usually the only ones who could afford to patron artwork, so peasants were never really depicted at this point. However, when the printing press arrived in Northern Europe, literature could be produced much more quickly and cheaply. Soon, works such as The Praise of Folly and 95 Thesis, which both discuss the importance of humanism and its enemies, notably the church's corruption, thirst for power, and failure to inspire people to live a Christian, humanistic life, emerged, and as they spread like wildfire, so did their ideas. Society began to yearn for new humanism-related material and became even more secular. Now, instead of traditional patronage, people began to see society's desire for humanism as a business opportunity, and publishing groups were formed. Since there was no longer traditional patronage here, artists and publishing groups could paint whatever they wanted as long as it would make them and their publishers money. And seeing society's recent changes, they began to seek out new, non-religious subjects that would farther advance humanism for their art. This is exactly what Bruegel the Elder did when he joined Hieronymus Koch's publishing group with the publication of The Peasant Wedding. This work's content was rather simple. A group of peasants have a feast after a wedding. However, its message was a bit radical. Artists only painted what they thought should be celebrated, and really never before had society thought that a group of peasants, who were lower-class people, should be celebrated in the manner that Bruegel did so. In one of society's very first celebrations of peasant life, Bruegel depicted a large group of people instead of individuals, so that there was no focus on the beauty of one person. While earlier Renaissance works were certainly realistic, they focused more on beauty, but this painting focuses virtually entirely on realism, as Bruegel uses the Renaissance art methods of perspective, color, vivid detail, and spacing to make his painting come alive. As a result, it can be concluded that Bruegel did not think that peasant life was important in the sense that it featured beautiful or important people, but rather by a much larger idea. Peasant life, though the life of lower-class people, was still life, and Bruegel believed that humanism should focus on the beauty of life itself rather than individuals. To him, life in general, people, the human spirit were all extremely important. Sure, a realistic peasant wedding with no particular emphasis on anything is quote-unquote nothing special, but it involved life, so it was in fact quite special. In fact, to further emphasize this, Bruegel did not make the conditions of this painting just average, but actually below average. The hay in the background shows that this feast is taking place in a barn, and the furniture is not very nice at all. Old wooden benches are used as seats at the old wooden table, and an old door that fell off of its hinges is being used as a serving tray. Furthermore, none of the subjects in the painting, despite being painted quite well, are all that good looking. Then, in the foreground, we see a child licking porridge off of his finger, and then another child in the background with his hand in his mouth, presumably trying to get to any leftover breadcrumbs. This behavior portrays the children as poorly behaved and gluttonous, boasts negative qualities. Even the food screams inferiority. Ale, porridge, and bread were the cuisines of choice for the poor. However, Bruegel includes all of this inferiority in his work for a reason, to accentuate his belief. Despite all of the poor conditions in the scene, there is still life. It may be alarmingly low-quality life, but it is life nonetheless. And to Bruegel, just any life involves people, the human spirit, the human soul, and it is therefore still tremendously valuable and something that deserves to be celebrated, as he does here through his artwork. Now, it is crucial to note that despite being known as the Peasant Bruegel for all of his paintings involving peasants, Bruegel himself was not a peasant, but rather he came from a large, powerful, and wealthy family of artists. This wasn't some peasant who decided to paint his own people out of self-pity, no. Here we have someone who is a high-class individual choosing, remember this work was not patroned, Bruegel could do whatever he wanted within reason, he was choosing to paint a low-class peasant feast in which by doing so he boldly states, sure, this may be a lower quality of life, but it is life nonetheless, and life itself at all levels is important and deserves to be celebrated. Now that's really big, as we see Bruegel start to try and shift the focus of humanism from celebrating the beauty and greatness of powerful individuals to the celebration of just life for all people. It shows how much it really means to him, as even as a high-class member of society, the life of peasants is still something that he wants to focus on and celebrate in his work. Another important aspect of this painting is its impeccable craftsmanship. I mean, it's just beautifully made. The use of perspective, color, such vivid detail, and spacing really do make this painting come alive. Furthermore, it is an oil-on-canvas painting, and while no exact records exist on how long it took, we can use the Mona Lisa as a reference, as it too was an oil painting. The Mona Lisa took around 4 years to paint, but since the peasant wedding is much larger, and I'd go as far as to even say a bit more detailed, it most likely took longer than 4 years. The high quality of Bruegel's artwork demonstrates that he really spent a lot of time on this, that the paintings and its messages genuinely meant a great deal to him. So the fact that he worked so hard on this shows that this idea of life at all levels being worthy of celebration was not something that he took lightly, but rather something that he very genuinely and strongly stood by. Nobody would work so hard on something if it didn't really mean something to him or her. These ideas of the painting's craftsmanship and Bruegel's high social class will continue to be important as we further discuss the painting and its influence on society. Now that you know that Bruegel clearly valued peasant life, you may be wondering what he thought of his own social class. Sure, of course he found the lives of high-class people to be important, but so did the rest of society, so he portrayed high-class members in a bit of a different manner. The bride, seated in front of the green cloth, may be a peasant, but the bride is the focal point of the wedding, and she symbolizes high-class individuals and even the church here. She has a crown both on her head and hanging above her, which symbolizes success and importance. So, like the other high-class members of the scene, she stands out a little bit. One crown would be fine. Higher-class people, those who work harder to reach success, deserve to be honored and recognized a bit more, but two is a bit over the top. This represents how, even though it was far better than it was in the Middle Ages, some high-class individuals and even the church were sometimes too greedy and thirsty for power, which leads to corruption. All of this is extremely detrimental to Bruegel's idea of humanism, as the high-class citizens and/or church having so much wealth and power suggests that the lives of lower-class citizens, like these peasants, aren't as important. This relates tremendously to the 1% issue in the United States today, as since the top 1% of people control so much of the nation's wealth, society tends to feel as if the lives of these people matter much more than that of the middle class and the poor, an idea that we see Bruegel here fighting so hard against. On the other hand, the other high-class individuals depicted in this painting don't really seem to be thirsty for power or corrupt at all. Farthest to the right, there is a man dressed in expensive black clothing with a long beard. This is the landowner, and his clothing sort of makes him stand out. He is talking with a Franciscan monk, who is actually a high-class religious being, identifiable by the white cloak that he's wearing. Finally, 2 seats to the right of the bride, we have the notary, who is the legal, religious official that oversees the wedding, who also stands out by his expensive clothing. Bruegel painted them so that they would stand out a little because just like in society, the high-class people stood out a little from the peasants. This shows that while society was far more equal than the Middle Ages, and that the idea of humanism was quite popular and enabled all lives to be valued and caused social class to be seen as less important, that these higher classes still did exist, and their sticking out represents how society viewed their lives as a little more important, even when they were not corrupt and overly thirsty for power, because they were wealthier, so they had more power, and more art made of and or for them, and so on. This went against Bruegel's idea of humanism, so he used this painting as a tool to bring differences in classes to people's attention so that they could make society more equal, which advances humanism. Also, the Franciscan and the notary are the only 2 really religious figures in the painting, which shows how society was becoming more secular, which was a good thing to Bruegel, as less church involvement allowed humanism to progress by enabling people to be more focused on celebrating life and less on strict religion. We must once again recognize here that Bruegel was a high-class individual himself, which is crucial to the development of this idea. He makes higher-class citizens stand out a bit and uses symbolism to criticize one of them, while the others just stand out a little bit because that's how they stand out in society. This shows his belief that when high-class citizens dominate wealth, power, and art, that their lives are seen as superior to that of lower-class citizens, which goes against his ideals. The impressive thing here is that Bruegel is actually criticizing his own people, showing that he recognizes that high-class individuals still do have flaws, and that his social class makes him no more or less of a person. This objectivism and lack of bias, being able to criticize his own class, tells viewers that when Bruegel states that all life has equal value and should be celebrated as such, he genuinely means it. He practices what he preaches. Bruegel demonstrates his belief in equality by recognizing the flaws of his class, and then shows his commitment to his idea of humanism, as by pointing out these flaws, he is indirectly calling upon his own people to change their lives so that the idea can advance. It was this genuineness of Bruegel that caused society to really believe in the messages of this piece of art and to change their lives accordingly as a result, which will be analyzed a bit more later on. Alright, so it's now overwhelmingly clear that Bruegel believed that the life of all people should be cherished, celebrated, and appreciated equally, regardless of class. But you may be wondering why. If one person was more successful than the other, then shouldn't their life value more? It makes sense, right? Well, Bruegel beautifully illustrates his beliefs through this particular scene which he chose to depict, a wedding feast. As Renaissance society was becoming more secular, shown by the lack of religious figures at the feast, so was marriage. Instead of focusing so much on the holy aspects of marriage, people focused more on the unity, love, and happiness that came along with it. These things are perceived as far more important than any material things that higher class people may have, and most importantly, they naturally occur in the lives of all people, regardless of class. As these are key aspects as to why life has so much value for all people, and why it is so worthy of praise, people must celebrate these often to quote-unquote fulfill the practice of humanism. So, why aren't the people at the feast doing so by talking, singing, and dancing? Well, instead of focusing on celebrating the unity, love, and happiness that marriage brings, most of the guests are focused on one thing and one thing only: food. A child in the foreground has a plate of porridge and licks his finger to make sure that he gets every last drop, while similarly, a child in the background has his hand in his mouth, probably trying to lick off any leftover breadcrumbs. Then, a servant is seen filling yet another jug of ale from a seemingly endless basket of jugs. Now, nobody knows for sure who the groom is, but historians believe that it is either the man in the foreground who is impatiently holding up his jug for a refill, as his face is a bit more defined than most of the others, or the man who is passing the porridge down the table from the servant's tray, with the latter being the most likely, as it was tradition for the groom to serve the bride's family. Which one it is really irrelevant, as no matter which one it actually is, the groom is still focused on food. The man in the foreground looks so impatient as he holds his mug up, demanding a refill, while the man passing down the porridge is spilling the first bowl, most likely because he is being careless because he wants to just hand all of them out as quickly as possible just so he can get to his own faster. This is truly terrible. On his wedding day, one of the most important days in a person's life, when he should be focused on celebrating unity, love, and happiness that come along with marrying a woman he apparently loves so much, all he seems to care about is food. Furthermore, more guests can be seen shoveling porridge into their mouths, asking for refills, and chugging their jugs of ale. In the back, even more jugs of ale and bread are brought in, and there is a large crowd of people, most likely jostling for positions so that they can get some of the new food and drink first. One of the musicians playing the pishpshak is staring hungrily at the food. Even the dog is focused on the food, patiently waiting for any scraps to fall under the table. Overall, the themes of gluttony and self-indulgence are quite apparent here. Just about everyone is focused on food instead of talking and celebrating the new marriage. Bruegel does this to show that how self-indulgence moves us farther away from humanism, as it distracts the people from what they should be doing, celebrating the unity, love, and joy that comes along with the special occasion of marriage. This is intended to move society closer to more humanism, as Bruegel shows how self-indulgence distracts people from what is truly important in life, and the people will then learn from this and apply these valuable lessons onto their own lives to advance humanism. Just think of this painting today if, instead of food, everybody was distracted by their iPhones and was missing out on the importance of family time, conversation, and bonding at the dinner table. Or better yet, an extremely relevant topic at the moment, the Powerball jackpot. If somebody wins the ridiculous $1.5 billion jackpot, he or she will likely become obsessed with money and buying material things for their own benefit. They will lose sight of the values in life that are truly important. This painting still applies so much to our lives today. It's just, as you see, in a slightly different context. And once again, I must reiterate, as these values are present in the lives of all people, regardless of class, this is truly why life is such a beautiful thing that must be celebrated among all people. It is key to notice that the higher class people in the painting are the only ones not riveted on the food. The landowner and Franciscan monk are having a conversation, while the bride and her parents, seated at her right and left, are sitting quietly instead of gorging themselves. The bride, her visible mother, and the notary actually all look a little displeased, probably because people are moving away from humanism by focusing on food instead of celebrating life, not to mention that it was a wedding day. See, those who were the most humanistic were generally the most successful in Renaissance times, and Bruegel shows this by having the higher class citizens try to celebrate life to no avail, while the regular peasants are distracted by the food. Bruegel, a high-class citizen himself, knows that living a humanistic life is important to success, so he shows the higher-class people trying to do so while the peasants are and remain peasants because they cannot truly embrace humanism. Rather, they are distracted by the food. Bruegel wanted peasants to see that this embracing of humanism was the key to success, which would get them to change their life by becoming less self-indulgent, causing them to be more successful as a result. In Bruegel's quest to have the lives of all valued and celebrated, he once again points out what precludes this from happening, as he did with the social class symbolism, and shows the positive results that occur when people alter their lives to fit his ideal. For this complex interaction of the idea of self-indulgence with society and the symbolism of social classes is far more than just a reference to a then recent famine in Breigel's home. It is rather a guide for how people ought to live in order to truly get the most out of life. All in all, to summarize this intellectual journey of Renaissance art, the peasant wedding drove the advancement of the Renaissance ideal of humanism by celebrating the lives of everyday people, promoting the importance and value of love and togetherness, and by combating self-indulgence, which prevented people from truly embracing humanism. In review, Bruegel shifted the focus of humanism from celebrating the individual beauty of high-class individuals to celebrating life itself, especially that of everyday people. Using marriage, he drew upon essential parts of life that are found in all social classes to illustrate how and why all lives matter and should be celebrated. Finally, he demonstrated how humanistic life leads to success, and how self-indulgence among both the rich and the peasants prevents the idea of humanism from truly being embraced, which inspired those who did so to change their ways in order to reach more success. He taught that worldly pleasures were okay, they were a part of the Renaissance, with society becoming more secular, but that too much of anything was always detrimental. The high-class position from which he freely, remember there was no patronage, he could do whatever he wanted within reason, freely painted the peasant wedding, and did all of this, along with his impeccable craftsmanship, enabled society to see his belief as strong, genuine, and advantageous to implement into their own lives. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the peasant wedding is worth 1 billion. And then some.